Our lesson today is from Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. It deals with the seven churches of Asia. And I found this way of dealing with them quite challenging. Not a bad way to deal with them, but it's different. The seven churches of Asia are seven churches of modern day Turkey, is what we're looking at. And there's a general outline for these letters in chapter 2 and 3 of Revelation. There is first a description of the glorified Christ, usually in terms of chapter 1 of what John saw. Then there is an evaluation of the church, and that's kind of the title of our lesson, Church Checkup. That evaluation of the church runs something like this. There is commendations or praise for the church. There's only one church that gets no praise, and that's Laodicea. There is weakness or criticism of the church. There's two churches that have no criticism, Smyrna and Philadelphia. Then there is instructions that go along with how to deal with the criticism or how to repair the area in which they're failing. And then the letter to the church comes to an end with listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And then there's a promise to each of the churches. There is ways of studying these churches that relate to the history of the cities. And those make really interesting studies. A couple of examples. If you take Laodicea, it is accused of being lukewarm. The people in Laodicea would have understood that. They had no source of water of their own. So, from Hierapolis, they piped water from the hot springs. From Colossae, they piped the cold water. But by the time it got to Laodicea, it was lukewarm. And so it wasn't useful for drinking, bathing, or whatever. It was lukewarm. It didn't taste good either. So, one from Philadelphia, I think, is the one where the promise is made. You will be a pillar in the temple of my God, and you will not have to go in or out. In AD 17, there was an earthquake that destroyed the city. And the people lived outside of the city for a number of weeks, maybe even up to a year, because of the aftershocks, not having to go in or out. Laodicea relates to that again because the Roman government exempted these places from paying taxes for 5 years so they could rebuild. But Laodicea said, nah, we don't need that help. We'll rebuild on their own, and they did. We can look at the cities, and we can learn a lot about the character of the church and from what Jesus said to them. We sometimes look at these churches and people study them as 7 successive ages of the church. And sometimes that may or may not be helpful. Because we always get hung up on a church like Philadelphia, but it's our Laodicea. And notice that Philadelphia is placed close to Laodicea. It might be better to look at these as representative of all churches of all times. You're going to have some churches that are going to be like Philadelphia and Smyrna. You're going to have others that have compromised and have false doctrine within them. So that's the way our lesson guide deals with this, by saying faithful believers overcome persecution. Faithful believers overcome false teaching. Faithful believers overcome temptation. So let's think about persecution for a bit. And the texts that they specifically mentioned for persecution are chapter 2, 8 through 10, verses 12 through 13, and 3, 10 through 12. And by the way, let me put a plug in for something that we advertised here. Just a minute. Right Now Media, they have a series called The Seven Churches of Revelation. The speaker on that is Stowell. And then our YouVersion Bible app has a couple of devotionals related to the seven churches of Asia, are the seven churches of Revelation. Those are interesting. Yes, Mike. Yes, and it's addressed to individuals within those churches. And thank you for making that point. That, you will see that in some of the churches like Sardis, it's called the dead church, but yet there's some in that church that are still okay. Other comments, observations? Please continue to make those. So let's think about the sources of persecution for the churches at that time. Let's remind ourselves that Jesus had told his followers in John 17, 15 through 16, "You are not of this world, as I am not of this world. If you were of this world, the world would love you." Okay? Keep that in mind. Keep in mind that in Matthew 5, 11 through 12, Matthew 10, starting with verse 16, he's telling his followers that they will face persecution. Romans 12, 1 and 2, talks to the followers of Christ to tell them not to be conformed to this world and its way of thinking. In my head, all of that relates to what the seven churches of Asia are dealing with. How do we maneuver life in this world? How do we make it through life in this world? And we're in the persecution part of it. The persecution comes from 4 sources, I can say. And that's, that's probably arbitrary. There's the local pagan devotion. All of these churches were in areas where the gods and the goddesses worshiped. Most notably, You see that example from Acts 19 with Ephesus, and how that the devotion to Artemis, or the goddess Diana, as some versions of the Bible call it, caused a riot. Not only because of the goddess, but because the silversmiths weren't making any money anymore, because the trade of buying the statues had dropped off. So you've got the pagan gods. The pagan gods were often associated with the trade guilds. So if you were a silversmith and the patron goddess or god was Artemis, and part of the participation of being in the trade guild was to be at the temple, eat the meal at the temple, do the stuff that they did in the pagan temples, guess what? You no longer have a job. People no longer buy your product. How do you deal with it? Then there was the unbelieving Jewish community. And we'll talk a little bit about that one. And the imperial cult. Imperial cult started out early as worship of the spirit of Rome. Then maybe it went to a previous or a great emperor. And then finally it came to a current emperor, especially in the days of Domitian, who decided, I am God. And he applied titles to himself, not only this God, not only this emperor, but others, such as Lord, Savior, Master. Hear echoes from something else. All those titles are applied to Christ by the Christians. And the way to deal with emperor worship was you take a pinch of incense, and to the imperial temple, you took that pinch of incense and you said, Caesar is Lord. You were given a certificate that said, witnesses saw that you did this. You're in good standing with the community. Your trade. You can buy and sell. You can participate in the community. Jews were exempt from this. They were exempt from this. And their names were on a roll. A book, if you will. These are Jews. These are faithful Jews. They don't have to participate in this. As the Christian community became to include Gentiles, definitely included Jesus as the Messiah, the Jews said, we don't want any part of these folks. So their names were removed from that list. And oftentimes the unbelieving Jewish community reported that these Christians, were not Jews. And so that took away the exemption from participating in the emperor cult worship. In 155 AD, the bishop of Smyrna, Polycarp, was burned at the stake. And the details of Polycarp's death are the first detailed description of martyrdom other than Stephen in the book of Acts. In the book of Revelation, you have a person named Antipas that was martyred, but you have no detail about it. But the detail of Polycarp's death, part of it may have developed into legend, but there's much of it that was definitely true. Polycarp seems to have had a dream a few weeks before his death in which his pillow caught on fire. He came to believe that that was a sign from the Lord that he was going to be burned at the stake. And he told some people about that. When the particular Roman governor of that area, and I'm not using the right title, I'm sure, took up a reason for going after Polycarp, there were people sent to arrest him. And he served them a meal. And he asked for an hour to pray that turned into 2 hours. And on their way back to the Roman governor, they tried to talk him out of saying he was Christian. The Roman governor even offered him ways to get out of it. And one quote from Polycarp that we have, 86 years I have served Christ, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my King who saved me? And at that, his sentence became final. It was usual that the prisoners were nailed to the stake, which they were burned. Polycarp just asked for them to tie his hands, which they did. The fires, at least according to the story, didn't burn his body. In fact, it seemed like they billowed around him to keep from burning his body. And finally, a soldier stabbed him with a spear, and blood came forth and put out the fire. They then burned his body because they were afraid that his body would be worshipped. So that's the story of Polycarp. And all of this occurred on the 23rd of 23rd of February in AD 155, 156. And it was a Saturday. It was a Sabbath day. Jews were said to have gathered sticks for the fire. And all Polycarp would have had to have done is to take the pinch of incense, threw it in the fire, and said, Caesar is Lord. Polycarp resisted. So, got a comment, Bruce?
Sardis was notable for a dead church as a whole. But as you mentioned, many of the people, certain people were doing the right things. It talks about the names and such that do not defile their garments.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of accepts it out the whole church. We have churches today saying, well, we've got a church that is established by God, but yet there are individuals that will be saved because of their dedication, loyalty to God, not to man.
Right. And that's a point that it's not churches that are saved per se. It's individuals within those churches. Churches that are considered faithful. It's because individuals in the church are considered faithful. Good point. If we look through what the text says on these churches, Smyrna, we just talked about Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, will have an extended period of persecution, 10 days, which probably means, considering certain things, that's short, but it's a significant time of persecution. While we note in Philadelphia, Revelation 3:10, they will be protected from a specific time of persecution. So there's a promise here, and I'm not sure which that one comes to. Of wearing the crown of life. That's either in 3 or 2. But let's talk a little bit about the concept of crowns in here. There's 2 types of crowns that are talked about in the book of Revelation. One is called the Stephanos. It's made out of plants like branches of olive trees and flowers. So what happens to those things after a period of time? They wilt. They go away. These types of crowns are given or were given to victorious generals. They were given to winners of athletic contests. What happens to the generals and what happens to the winners of the athletic contest? They eventually wither away also. So these were temporary. The royal crown is called the diadem. And it's only mentioned 3 times in the book of Revelation, 12:3, 13:1, and 19:12. The first 2 wearers of the diadem are impostors. They're the dragon and the beast. But in 19:1, or 19:12, the wearer of the diadem is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, the Christ himself. And he puts down any other attempt to wear the diadem. So, the victor's crown that Jesus promised, unlike the victor's crown of the generals, unlike the victor's crown of the athlete, will not wither away. It's eternal. It doesn't fade. Revelation 2:10, 1 Peter 5:4. Okay, any questions about that section on persecution.
The source of the devil.
Yeah. And all of that comes from the devil. It comes through those various ways that I mentioned, at least for those 4 churches. And I won't get in trouble, but we basically face the same type of stress and structure today. The world system is opposed to God. There are Christians in the world that are persecuted by their governments. We can think of Iran. We can think of China, North Korea, almost any Islamic country, Thailand. I think it's Thailand. No, that's not. It's not right. It's Burma. As a serious problem for Christians.
Indonesia, my brother was there. They were persecuted. They didn't have
Okay, Indonesia, India, to some degree. Many of these countries have laws against conversions to other religions, except the accepted one. Then within those areas, you've got kids, you've got a family. You've got to make a living to feed your kids. How do you do this without the compromise? And that's what people were facing. That may be what we don't particularly think about that here. But that may be what future generations face here. How close did we become to emperor worship in our last 2 presidents? I know one of them was called Messiah. He didn't do any pushback against it. Another one has been venerated almost to the level of Messiah. Like I said, I'm going to get myself in trouble with that statement. But how close did we become to the worship of the emperor? Yeah. So that's where we are. Any comments or observations you want to make about that? If not, we move on to false teaching. Yeah. David. I was trying to avoid that. No, not yet. Yeah. Okay. In our churches, we have multiplicity of elders. These churches were different in that they were house churches. So was there one presiding elder over all the house churches? It's a question you've got to deal with. Is this the evangelist? of the church.
Or they it's pastor incorrect.
Well, yeah, but
Every preacher was a pastor in every church, except Church of Christ unquote.
yeah, well,
Pastor.
yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, David. But that you're right. It's a question we need to wrestle with. There is a passage in First or Second Timothy, maybe Titus, that puzzles me just a bit. And again, guys, you may say, I don't want this fool up here teaching anymore. But there's this passage. He didn't say ordain elders in every church. He said city. So that may change your outlook on church structure. Yes, Mike.
It makes sense that there was a leader, at least in the church. The apostles were the one at the time that started these. Someone had to be in charge.
True. And Timothy was left in charge to set things right in Ephesus. So, and you're right. So, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Titus 1:5. Okay. So, any other questions or monkey wrenches you want to throw into it? So the next one that they arranged this around was false teaching. And there are multiple warnings in the scriptures about false teaching. 1 Timothy 1:3-4, 2 Peter 2:1-3, Jude 1:3-4. It's interesting that both Jude and Peter will mention Balaam, because this is going to be one that's going to be used in this section. So we come back to Ephesus. It is a church that had maintained doctrinal purity. In chapter 2 and verse 6, they hate the works of the Nicolaitans. There's another church that has embraced the, and man, I goofed up because I didn't write those down where it was mentioned again. Tyra. Oh, it's the church of Pergama that has embraced the Nicolaitans. So, first of all, minor compromises with the spirit of the world can damage the church, can destroy the church. It can pollute the church. And those ideas are mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:6-13. So, in Pergama, we have people that have embraced the teaching of Balaam, verse 2:14, and have embraced the work or the practice of the Nicolaitans. Now, let's think a little bit about these terms and what might be represented here. First of all, Balaam is an Old Testament story. Everybody knows the Old Testament story about Balaam, talking donkey. Balaam was a soothsayer. He had some knowledge of the true God, and he seemed to have a pantheon, maybe, of gods, in which the true God was one in that pantheon of gods. So he was going to curse the Israelites, or this is what King Balak wanted him to do. King Balak was the king of Moab. And God would not allow Balaam to curse Israel with his spoken word. In fact, he turned Balaam's spoken word into a blessing each time. Okay? So, that's where we get, and those stories are found in Numbers 22 through Numbers 25. He is also mentioned in Numbers 31, 15 and 16, Joshua 13:22, Joshua 24, Deuteronomy 23:4, 2 Peter 2:15, Jude 11, 2 Peter 2:16, Nehemiah 13:2, and Micah 6:12. So he gets quite a bit of press in the Bible. Now, let's turn to the Nicolaitans. Mentioned, like we said, Revelation 2:15, Revelation 2:6. The church fathers, are many of them, associated him with Nicholas of Acts 15, or Acts 6, one of the 7 deacons who became a heretic and led his followers astray. And some of the writers of the time, Irenaeus, say they have forsaken Christian doctrine of life of unrestrained indulgence. Hippocrates left correct doctrine, habit of indifference to what men should eat or how they should live. Clement of Alexander's defends Nicholas. He says the followers misunderstood Nicholas, but they abandoned themselves to pleasure like goats in a life of shameless indulgence. So this is the characteristic of those people. Another interesting concept is that this might be a wordplay. Nicholas comes from 2 Greek words, Nikon, to conquer, and Laos, the people. Balaam, a Hebrew word, comes from Bela, to conquer, and Ham, the people. So it may be a wordplay that these teachers conquered the people. Now, we said that Balaam was not allowed to curse the people of Israel with his words, but he did curse people of Israel. He told the Moabites and the Midianites, get them to engage in the worship of Baal. He knew that their God would not allow such activity, and they would be cursed. So, false teaching. Another one was the prophetess Jezebel. I mean, dualism, syncretism. You can have your God, I can have mine. We'll all get along and everything's fine. Bumper sticker coexist with all the religious symbols of various religious symbols of the world. And then the compromise of Gnosticism was, or at least its seeds were coming into the church at this time. Probably a combination of Greek philosophy that the body, was evil, the spirit was good. So it doesn't really matter what you do to the body. It can do anything it wants to pleasure itself, or asceticism. Both extremes. Doesn't really matter. All that matters is spirit. Spirit's good. Sometimes we get in our heads, as long as I have the right beliefs, it doesn't really matter how I live. As long as I know that God can forgive me and do whatever I please, all I have to do is just ask for forgiveness. That's kind of flippant. Can get us in trouble. Of course, Jezebel is mentioned in chapter 2:18. She is a prophet or a teacher in this church of Thyatira. And then the last one, and we'll just briefly run through those, is temptation. We already mentioned the immorality that was associated with some of the teachings that came from the Nicolaitans. How do you live in this world and are not tainted by it? How do you live in this world and you're not compromised by it? How do you not let your thinking conform you to what you see in this world? And that's probably the problem. The Ephesian church, they had the correct doctrine. They identified as Christians. And it's easier to follow Christ if you have a checklist of doctrines that you say, I believe this, and then behaviors. Sardis, the dead church, had a good reputation, and they were trying to rely on that. The reputation didn't lead them on. Laodicea, the deceitfulness of wealth, got them in trouble. They could really say, we did it on our own. We rebuilt our city. And if I had time, I would like to go through the promises, but people are already out there, so it's time to be over with. Thanks for listening.